Hello guys, and welcome to another video. And in this one we're going to be looking at a comparison of unique body armors on the Juggernaut. We've got the brass dome, of course, the classic unique for the Juggernaut. It's just so powerful on this ascendancy, incredible synergy with Unbreakable. You get the massive amount of armor, the flat armor on that chest getting doubled by the Unbreakable node, and then the increased maximum elemental resistances. These combine to make the mini transcendence effect on the Unbreakable node even more powerful. This is because you'll be able to mitigate a larger amount of elemental damage taken from hits with the resistance first, which will then make the 8% of armor applied to elemental damage taken even stronger due to armor being more effective against smaller hits. And that's the brass dome. Everyone knows how good it is on Juggernaut. It's such a strong body armor. But what about the new kid on the block in this league, the fourth vow? Brand new, introduced in 3.21 Crucible, and this is a unique that has a special modifier on it that applies your full armor scaling to chaos damage taken from hits. And this is a really strong modifier because it can be combined with Divine Flesh to make it so that you take 50% of all elemental damage as chaos damage, and therefore you can benefit from the incredible defensive mechanic on half of that elemental damage you take. And on Juggernaut, this is just made even stronger because you still retain that mini transcendence effect from Unbreakable on the other half of damage that doesn't get converted into chaos. And of course, because you're splitting the damage and armor is being applied separately in that calculation, the armor is once again going to be more effective to the smaller hits due to the damage being split in half, and so that's going to be really powerful. Now, I wanted to keep this comparison as fair as possible, and so we're using a brass dome with a top roll of 5% to all maximum resistances and a middle roll of 375% increased armor. Right now on softcore trade Crucible, a brass dome with a similar stat starts at about 1.3 divines. And the fourth vow has a top roll of 250% increased armor. That's the only stat that you really care about other than the chaos resistance there. And that starts at about 1 divine. And of course, the glorious vanity jewel that the fourth vow build needs also starts at around 10 chaos, so it's fairly comparable in terms of cost. And for this comparison, we're using an average Bone Shatter passive skill tree. It's around level 95. Both trees have almost identical pathing. The only difference is here at Elemental Equilibrium, where the fourth vow setup is pathing through here to slot the glorious vanity jewel in for Divine Flesh. And the brass dome is pathing a little bit lower down there, just below Vow Pack, to take some more armor scaling for about the same amount of points spent. And the config for each setup is the same. We're just ticking endurance charges and fortify. The endurance charges coming from Inexorable, the passive tree node that gives you endurance charges or a chance to gain them when you get hit. And of course, we're getting hit all the time because we're using Bone Shatter. And the fortify from the support gem linked to Bone Shatter. Also, both setups are using Determination. They both have Precision linked to Arrogance, which is activating the +1 maximum elemental resistance mastery from the reservation wheel. And on the helmet for each build, we have some Fizz damage taken as mods. Both builds have the crafted Fizz taken as fire mod, and the brass dome setup has the Ether Worlds implicit that has Fizz taken as cold, while the fourth vow setup has the Ether Worlds implicit that has Fizz taken as chaos. And each setup has a belt with crafted armor. And we don't have any kind of life modifiers or anything like that on our gear because we're only interested in how much damage each setup will take. But it is worth noting that the fourth vow setup will be able to get a higher life total with the same gear due to the modifier on brass dome that removes the implicit life scaling from strength. So here are the stats for these two builds. They have the same gear equipped with the only exception of the body armors and the helmet mods that I just talked about. And you can just see immediately how powerful the brass dome armor scaling is. That massive chunk of flat armor that you get from the brass dome. The total comes to just over double the fourth vow setup. And the brass dome has a little bit more increased armor in the config, as I said, due to that pathing where the fourth vow needs to take Divine Flesh. And obviously, the brass dome setup has an additional 5% maximum elemental resistances coming from the brass dome unique itself, while the fourth vow has the extra 5% max chaos resistance from Divine Flesh. Both builds are likely to get close to spell suppression cap with good gear, but for this comparison, we're not adding that in. So let's get into the comparison. We're using the presets in Path of Building, and these presets use a damage range roll of about 70%. We're going to compare actual boss abilities, starting off with some normal non-Uber Pinnacle bosses. And let's begin with the Eater of Worlds beam ability. This ability hits for about 24,000 lightning damage. So it's a big hit of lightning damage. And you can see that the incoming damage numbers here on each setup actually differ slightly. This is because this is factoring in the small critical strike chance that the boss has to land a hit that deals a bit more damage. And of course, the Brass Dome has the modifier that you take no extra damage from critical strikes. So I think it's important to actually factor that in because that's a really nice defensive mechanic to have. But of course, a critical strike is quite rare, and this is just factoring in that small chance, so this is averaging out the damage ranges slightly. And you can just immediately see how powerful that full armor application mechanic from the fourth vow is. Even against an ability with no elemental penetration, the fourth vow setup takes slightly lower damage, but it's close in this one. This is a close comparison. What about a Shaper Slam? This is a hit of about 13,700 damage, and it's purely physical. Brass Dome comes out way ahead in this one. I think it's kind of expected, that huge chunk of armor on the Brass Dome going to work here against the purely physical damage hit. And now we've got a Cirrus Meteor. This is a big hit split up into about 12,500 damage of each of these types. That's physical, lightning, fire, and chaos. And this one is really, really close. You can see how much work the fourth vow's modifier is putting in here with the 26,000 chaos damage being taken and reduced down to just 1,800. But the Brass Dome comes out ahead by a little bit here. And what about some Uber boss abilities? Let's take a look here, and we're going to start off with the Uber Exarch Bull Phase. These hit for about 17,300 fire damage. This one is really close. The Brass Dome setup takes just a bit more damage than the fourth vow. But what about an ability that has a large amount of elemental penetration? Let's take a look at the Uber Shaper Bull. This one hits for nearly 14,000 cold damage, but it has a huge 40% cold penetration. And you can just see the massive difference here. When an ability has penetration, look at how much it completely devastates the Brass Dome setup. And the fourth vow is able to take far less damage in this comparison because it's able to avoid penetration on half of that damage. And that's a big, big difference there. And what about a giant hit of elemental damage? Let's take a look at the Uber Azeri Flame Blast. This one is about 120,000 fire damage. A massive hit. It also has 10% fire penetration. And the fourth vow pulls ahead here. This is not so much due to the penetration this time, but it's more so because the 8% of armor being applied to the damage taken from the Brass Dome becomes fairly ineffective due to just how big the hit is even after resistance. Meanwhile, the fourth vow setup is able to split the damage, making the armor calculation more effective on both sides. And it's worth noting here that the Brass Dome setup will be more effective against elemental damage over time because it has naturally higher resistances against those, like the ground effects that you get on the Maven and Shaper fights. And the fourth vow setup will be more effective, of course, against chaos damage over time, like poison. But overall, I think these two setups are somewhat comparable. The Brass Dome setup will be typically much stronger against physical damage hits due to the massive amount of armor that it's able to achieve on the same investment. Meanwhile, the fourth vow setup really shines against elemental damage hits that have large amounts of penetration, and against hits that have combined damage of different types, or elemental hits without penetration, the setups take a very similar amount of damage. It's also worth mentioning that the Brass Dome setup has, of course, got an open Timeless Jewel slot, and that could be an upside there. If you wanted to use some kind of Timeless Jewel, you could slot in Lethal Pride and get some good stats from that. And of course, the Brass Dome has that modifier that we talked about a little bit earlier, the take no extra damage from critical strikes, which is a nice defensive mechanic to have in your build. And the fourth vow setup is likely going to need to invest a bit heavier into armor and physical damage mitigation to be able to compete with the Bone Shattered trauma scaling, as even at about 20 stacks, it's already taking about twice the amount of physical damage per hit as the Brass Dome setup is taking. And that's it, guys. The comparison of the Brass Dome and the fourth vow on the Juggernaut. I think these two are really, really powerful body armors on Juggernaut. They're both really powerful body armors in general in the game right now. The fourth vow is probably a bit stronger on other ascendancies, just due to how well that scales with just armor and the Divine Flesh keystone. And I think this is a really cool comparison to make because the Brass Dome has been really strong on Juggernaut, especially recently after that mini Transcendence was added to Unbreakable. And the fourth vow is really, really competitive. A very, very strong body armor. I wonder if it's going to be a bit rarer next patch. Maybe it's not quite as common as it is, but very strong showing there against the Brass Dome. And hopefully this comparison was helpful to show you where each setup has its advantages and its downsides. And let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. And as always, stay tuned and stay safe.